The Verith cruiser dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kepler-7 system at 0314 standard hours. Silent. No warning. No broadcast. Just a ship that was not there, and then was. Nobody on the outpost saw it coming. The long-range sensor array had been flagged for maintenance 11 days before. The technician assigned to fix it had put in 3 separate parts requests. The parts were somewhere between the supply depot at Aldous Station and a shipping manifest that nobody had bothered to properly file. The technician had stopped asking. She had written a 4th request, marked it urgent in red, and then gone to bed because there was nothing else she could do, and the coffee in the mess hall was better in the morning. Now, Commander Soth Kirill stood at the forward observation deck of the cruiser and looked at the target through the viewport glass. Even with magnification at full, the outpost was small. It was a cluster of 6 modules, connected by pressurized corridor sections, orbiting a gas giant that did not have a name in Verith star charts. Only a long string of numbers and letters that nobody ever said out loud. The comms relay dish on the station's upper spine was the largest visible structure, and it was still rotating, doing its slow and patient job, completely unaware of what was parked 700 kilometers away in the dark. The cargo bays on the lower section looked slightly misaligned, like something had bumped them and nobody had quite gotten around to correcting it. One of the 3 docking ports had visible stress fractures in the hull seal that the scanner picked up easily. Soth Kirill looked at the stress fractures for a moment. He looked at the rotating dish. He looked at the lights in the habitat modules, small and warm and completely visible against the dark of space, the way lights always looked when they didn't know anyone was watching. His analyst had briefed him 2 hours before. 47 personnel, signal relay primary function, border monitoring secondary function, no offensive weapon systems, no defensive shields beyond standard collision deflectors, which were not rated for weapons fire. Strategic value to the Terran compact rated as low. Low. He had underlined that word in his mission briefing, not because he doubted it, because it confirmed what he already knew. The outpost was not a military installation in any meaningful sense. It was not a threat. It was a listening post dressed up in infrastructure, sitting in a corridor of space that the Verith Dominion had a legitimate territorial claim to. And its presence there was a provocation that the Terran Compact had been getting away with for 4 years, while the High Council ran diplomatic circles around the problem without resolving it. He had argued for action in 2 separate closed sessions. He had used words like proportional and necessary, and clearly within the scope of authorized border management. He had been patient. He had waited for the Council to finish its deliberations. Now he had his authorization. He gave the order to fire at 0317. The first volley was targeted at the relay dish. Cut the signal before the outpost could broadcast. His targeting team trained for this specific sequence. The dish came apart in a clean bloom of debris, 3 distinct pieces spinning away from the station in different directions. Through the magnified viewport, Soth Kirill watched each piece until they drifted out of frame. His signals officer said the dish had gone offline in the first 2 seconds of the strike. The second volley hit the power core. He watched the lights go out. He had done 14 engagements in his career. Power core failures always went the same way. A cascade, one section pulling reserves from another, the lights dimming in stages, the station fighting to keep itself alive. It was usually slow enough to be uncomfortable to watch. This outpost's lights went out in 4 seconds. One section, then the next, then all of them, like a decision. It's like someone inside had simply reached over and turned off the switch because there was no point fighting it. His engineer noted it later, said whoever designed the outpost's internal power distribution had done exceptional work. Efficient load balancing, every system drawing from a central node. It meant that when the node failed, everything failed together instead of dragging it out. Good engineering, his engineer said. Had to give them that. The emergency beacon started 11 seconds after the power hit. His signals officer flagged it immediately. Automated system, independent power cell. It had kicked in the moment main power died, and it was broadcasting on the standard Galactic Coalition emergency frequency. Coordinates, distress code, station identifier on a loop. Jam it, Soth Kirill said. We're trying. Sir. His signals officer's hands were moving across the board. It's cycling. Every time we lock a frequency, it shifts to another one. He looked at the readout. The beacon was small and it was fast, and it was doing exactly what someone had designed it to do. Whoever wrote the software had thought about this exact situation. They had thought about what happened when the main systems died and the main comms went dark, and there was something hostile parked nearby with a jamming array, and they had built a solution. Someone had cared enough to build a solution. He ordered the third volley. The outpost broke apart in the center section first. The pressurized corridors between modules lost integrity in a fast chain. One seal failed, then the next. Then the structural members that connected the module housings buckled under the pressure change and the hit. Debris came out in a spherical pattern, caught almost immediately in the distant pull of the gas giant's gravity, beginning an orbit that would take several centuries to decay naturally. The cargo bays went with the center, the intact docking port and the damaged one, the habitat modules, the mess hall where the coffee was better in the morning, the technicians' quarters where the fourth parts request was still sitting in an outgoing mail queue that would never send. The hydroponics bay was in the lower rear section of the station. It was the last part to hold structure, 40 seconds, maybe 45. It tumbled in the debris field, rotating slowly, still sealed, the hull intact. And the grow lights inside it were still on, either running on their own emergency cell or pulling something from residual power in the lines. It was hard to tell from the scanner readings. They were on. The scanner registered the heat signature of living plant matter through the hull as the bay tumbled. Then the hull finally gave, and the pressure went, and the lights went with it. South Korea noted the engagement time when his engineer called it. 9 minutes and 40 seconds from first contact to no contact. The beacon was still transmitting. He looked at the signal readout. It was in the debris field somewhere, too small to get a targeting lock on, still cycling through frequencies, still broadcasting its loop. Coordinates, distress code, station identifier. Over and over, into the dark, the way it had been built to do. How long before the power cell dies, he said. 8 to 12 hours, his signals officer said, depending on the model. He nodded. The South Korea would be back across the border in 2 hours. The beacon would die long after they were gone, transmitting into empty space. File the report, he said to his adjutant. Border zone incident. Disputed territorial corridor, Section 7 Gamma. Authorized operation under Council Directive 44. No Verith military losses or damage. Target was confirmed monitoring installation. No offensive armament. No defensive capability. His adjutant's stylus moved. Casualty notation for outpost personnel? South Korea thought about this for exactly as long as the protocols required him to think about it. The coalition required a notation. It was a formality. 47, he said. Terran compact personnel. Killed in action during authorized border security operation. His adjutant wrote the number. 47. The report was formatted, flagged for submission to the High Council's Border Affairs Division, and placed in the outgoing queue before the South Korea had even turned around. South Korea went to his quarters. He changed out of his command uniform. He ate a meal that his steward had kept warm. He lay down on his bunk and he thought, in the specific way that careful and disciplined commanders thought, about whether he had made any errors in the operation. He had not. He was certain of this. Every step had followed the authorization. Every action had been proportional to the objective. 47 personnel was not a small number, and he was not the kind of commander who pretended otherwise. But it was within the parameters of a legitimate military operation in a disputed zone, and the Terran Compact had been warned, through back channels and diplomatic language, that continued use of the corridor for monitoring purposes would be considered a hostile act. They had been warned. He slept. He did not dream about the grow lights. He did not dream about the last 40 seconds when the hydroponics bay was the only lit thing in the debris field. He did not dream about what had been growing under those lights, or who had planted it, or why anyone would grow things at the very edge of mapped space. He was a careful man, and careful men controlled their dreams. 7 light minutes away at Relay Station Delta 9, a systems monitor named Priya Okafor was 40 minutes into the 3rd hour of her overnight shift. She was 26. She was reading a novel on her personal handheld and drinking something that had stopped being coffee around the time she stopped paying attention to it. The automated monitoring system ran its sweeps in the background the way it always did. Steady, methodical, generating output that almost never needed a human being to do anything about it. The distress alert came in at 0411. She put her novel down in 4 seconds. Took 2 more seconds to read the header. The distress code was Kepler 7. She stopped moving. She knew Kepler 7. 6 months ago, she had run supply coordination with the station for a parts requisition. 3 weeks of back and forth over inventory codes and shipping routes. She had spoken directly with the station's logistics coordinator, a man named Torres, who had a habit of making very specific jokes about bureaucratic forms that were exactly as funny as jokes about bureaucratic forms had any right to be. She had genuinely laughed twice. She had forgotten what the jokes were about. She remembered the laughing. She pulled up the beacon data, coordinates, distress code, station identifier, loop count. She looked at the timestamp on the first transmission. She looked at the current time. She did the math without meaning to. 9 hours. The beacon had been transmitting for 9 hours before it reached her. She did not think about what that meant for a moment. Then she thought about it. Then she stopped thinking about it and started moving, because moving was something she could do, and the other thing was not. She forwarded the alert to her supervisor's queue, to standard protocol. Then she did the non-standard things, forwarded it to the Terran Compact Military Relay Node, to the Civilian Emergency Registry, to the Galactic Coalition Monitoring Desk, and to 2 contact addresses she had never actually used before, that she had memorized from a training document 2 years ago because she had a good memory, and the document had said these addresses were for incidents of a certain kind, and she thought this might be an incident of that kind. Then she sat back and looked at the screen. The relay station was quiet around her. She could hear the ventilation system. She could hear her own breathing. Outside the observation port, the stars didn't move. The first acknowledgement came back from the military relay node in 11 minutes. She had forwarded distress signals before. Equipment malfunctions. A medical emergency on a cargo freighter. A navigation failure. Those acknowledgments came back in hours, sometimes days. 11 minutes was not how acknowledgments came back. She read the confirmation code 3 times. The second acknowledgement, from one of the 2 addresses she had never used, came with an additional line at the bottom. Acknowledgments didn't have additional lines. They were automated confirmations, clean and functional, and identical every time. This one said, timestamp confirmed. All beacon data preserved in full. Chain of custody established. Do not delete logs. Priya read the line. Read it again. Chain of custody was a legal term. It was the kind of term that appeared in proceedings, in cases, in situations where someone was building a record of events for a purpose that required the record to be unimpeachable. She looked at the Kepler 7 designation. She looked at the 9-hour gap. She looked at the loop count on the beacon data, which told her how many times the distress signal had repeated before the power cell died. And she counted back from that to the moment it had started. And she sat with what that moment meant. She didn't sleep when her shift ended at 0600. She went to the mess hall and sat with a cup of coffee that she poured and didn't drink. The stars outside the porthole were the same stars they always were. The station hummed around her, doing what stations did, keeping things running, keeping the air breathable, keeping the lights on. Somewhere past the viewport, 7 light minutes away, the debris field at Kepler 7 drifted in slow orbit around a gas giant that had no name. The grow lights were gone. The bay was gone. Whatever had been growing there was tumbling in the dark now, freezing, past any saving. The botanist who had planted it, Dr. Lena Marsh, 29 years old, who had named her tomato varieties after planets in old Earth science fiction novels and kept the names in a personal log on a local drive that was also now drifting in the debris, had cared about those plants the way people who live at the edge of nothing care about small things. As an argument, as proof that something living was still here, still worth tending. Nobody knew her name yet. Nobody had gone through the personnel files yet. The 47 were still a number. Numbers were easier than names. Numbers didn't make jokes that you remembered laughing at, even when you'd forgotten the joke. Priya sat with her cold coffee and looked at the stars and thought about the word custody and what it meant when a government used legal language in the dark hours of the morning in response to a beacon from a border outpost that had been rated low. In a building on Earth that had no public address, a woman named Avra Solis was being woken up. She was 53 years old, short gray hair. She had spent 31 years in Terran Compact External Affairs, which meant she had spent 31 years watching the ways that other species looked at humanity and made calculations about what they could get away with. She had become very good at knowing which calculations were errors. Her assistant handed her a tablet in the doorway of her bedroom. She read it standing up, still in the clothes she had gone to bed in, because she had learned a long time ago that some things didn't wait for you to be properly dressed. She read the beacon data, the timestamp, the 9-hour gap, the preliminary analysis from the military relay node, which laid out in clean and specific sentences what the physical evidence suggested had happened at Kepler-7 and what the debris pattern indicated about the type of weapons used and what the origin vector of the debris suggested about where the attacking vessel had come from. She read it once. She dressed. She did not eat. She drove herself to the office, something she almost never did because there were people whose job it was to drive her, and she respected their jobs. This morning she drove herself because she needed the 12 minutes alone. She sat at her desk and read the report a second time, slowly. She was not misunderstanding it. 47. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk and took out a piece of paper. Actual paper. She used it for things she wanted to exist only once, in one place, in her handwriting, not in any system. She had the personnel roster on her tablet. She had read the names in the car. She wrote them now, by hand, all 47, taking her time with each one. When she was done, she folded the paper and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, against her chest. She held her hand flat against it for a moment. Then she let go. The Galactic Coalition session was in 6 days. There was work to do. On the Soth Kaas, crossing back into Varith space, Commander Soth Kirill was sleeping soundly in his bunk. The report was in the queue. The operation was closed. He had done everything correctly. He was sure of it. He was sure of it the way a man is sure of something when he has never had reason to doubt it. When nothing in his experience has given him the specific and necessary information that would tell him he has made a mistake so foundational that no amount of correctness in the execution could repair it. The debris at Kepler-7 drifted. The gas giant turned. The dark was very quiet. It would not be quiet for long. The Galactic Coalition chamber on Nexus Station held 214 seats arranged in a wide arc facing a central floor. Each seat had a translation earpiece, a small water dispenser, and a name placard in the primary script of whichever species occupied it. The chamber had been designed to feel equal. Same height, same sight lines, same distance from the floor. And the architects had been very deliberate about this. Every species in the same room, at the same level, facing the same center. It almost worked. Ambassador Vel San of the Varith Dominion arrived early on the morning of the 6th day. This was unusual. Varith ambassadors traditionally arrived precisely on time, because arriving early suggested anxiety, and the Dominion had a strong cultural position on not appearing anxious. Vel San arrived 11 minutes early and spent those 11 minutes standing at his seat, reviewing his prepared remarks on a handheld, not looking at the door. He had prepared his remarks carefully. The Dominion's legal team had worked for 5 days on them. They were built around 4 main pillars: the legitimacy of the territorial dispute in Section 7 Gamma, and the Terran Compact's documented history of using monitoring installations as political leverage in contested corridors, the proportionality of the response relative to the provocation, and the established coalition precedent from the Dresh border incident 14 years ago, in which a similar action had resulted in a formal censure and a required withdrawal timeline rather than anything more severe. The Dresh incident was the most important pillar. It set the ceiling. It told the room what the maximum consequence looked like. Vel San had read the Dresh ruling 11 times. Other delegations arrived. The chamber filled. The low sound of translation earpieces activating, of chairs adjusting, of water dispensers being used. The normal texture of a coalition session beginning. The Terran Compact delegation arrived 2 minutes before the session opened. There were 4 of them: 2 junior attachés, 1 legal advisor, and Secretary Avra Salas. They moved to their seats without talking to anyone. The junior attachés arranged documents on the desk surface. The legal advisor opened a portfolio. Secretary Solis sat down and put nothing on the desk in front of her. No documents, no handheld, no water. She folded her hands. Velsan watched her from across the arc of the chamber. He had met Avra Solis twice before, once at a trade negotiation 3 years ago, and once at a border demarcation conference 18 months before that. She was not a dramatic person. She did not perform. She was the kind of diplomat who made you feel, when she was speaking, that she had already considered everything you were about to say and had moved past it. She was looking at the center floor. She was not looking at him. The session chair opened the formal record at 900. Coalition standard procedure, agenda acknowledgement, quorum confirmation, opening of the floor for the matter at hand. The matter at hand was the Kepler-7 incident, filed under emergency session protocol by the Terran Compact delegation, 48 hours after Priya Okafor had forwarded the beacon data. The session chair read the incident summary into the record. Clean, neutral language, the coordinates, the date, the classification of the installation, the casualty figure, 47. The chamber was quiet while the chair read it. The chair finished and looked to the Varith delegation. Standard procedure. To the party whose action had prompted the session spoke first. Velsan stood. He read his prepared remarks in a clear, measured voice. He took 23 minutes. The 4 pillars, laid out carefully with supporting references, the territorial legitimacy, the proportionality precedent, the Dresch ruling. He was thorough. He was calm. He was exactly as good at this as he had been trained to be. When he finished, he sat down and looked at the Terran Compact delegation. Secretary Solis was still looking at the center floor. She had not moved during his 23 minutes. She had not taken notes. She had not whispered anything to her legal advisor. She had simply sat with her hands folded, looking at the floor, as though she was waiting for something that had nothing to do with what he was saying. The session chair turned to the Terran Compact. Secretary Solis, the floor is yours. She stood. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and took out a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it flat on the desk in front of her and looked up at the chamber. The Terran Compact acknowledges the condolence message submitted by the Varith Dominion through diplomatic channels 4 days ago, she said. Her voice was even. It was the voice of someone reading from a list of facts. We have entered it into the formal record. It is there. She paused. I would like to request a private session with the full coalition mediation panel, she said. Today, before this session closes. That was it. She sat down. Velsan stared at her. Around the chamber, 214 seats held their occupants in various states of stillness. The Cathari ambassador, who was 400 years old and had attended sessions covering 2 interstellar wars and 1 species extinction event, was watching the Terran Compact desk with the specific attention of someone who had learned to pay attention to things that were too quiet. The session chair approved the mediation request. The main session recessed. The mediation panel convened in the side chamber immediately. Velsan was not in the mediation panel. He stood in the corridor outside the side chamber with his junior attaché and waited. He waited for 40 minutes. Secretary Solis came out first. She walked past him without looking at him. Her junior attachés followed. Her legal advisor was last, and for just a moment, not long, to barely a second, her legal advisor looked at Velsan with the expression of someone who knows something you don't and is not going to tell you. Then the mediation panel came out. The panel was 7 members, senior delegates from 7 of the 14 founding species. Velsan knew all of them. He had worked with 4 of them directly. None of them would look at him. He approached the panel chair, a Theresi elder named Counselor Meath, with whom he had a professional relationship going back 8 years. Counselor, he said, could you tell me the content of the private session? Counselor Meath looked at him. Not the way she usually looked at him. Not the way she looked at a colleague. The way she looked at a word in a sentence that she was still trying to understand. And the session content has been sealed under confidential mediation protocol, she said. We are not able to share it. Can you tell me the general? No, she said, and she walked away. Velsan stood in the corridor. His junior attaché was very young and had never attended a session like this. Ambassador, she said carefully, what did they say to the panel? I don't know, he said. Should we be concerned? He thought about Avrasoli sitting with her hands folded, looking at the center floor. Through 23 minutes of his most careful, prepared remarks, he thought about 4 words. It is there. And what it meant that she had responded to a full legal defense with 4 words and a paper in her pocket and a request for a private room. Start transmitting to the High Council, he said. Sure, market priority. He went back to his seat in the main chamber and looked at the Terran compact desk, which was now empty, its occupants already gone, their chairs pushed back into place with the polite tidiness of people who had finished what they came to do. He had no idea what they had come to do. That was the thing that he would not be able to explain later when people asked him about this day. Not the military response, not the fleet, not what came at the end. What he could not explain was this moment. The moment he realized that the Terran Compact had walked into the coalition chamber with a very clear plan, and he had not been able to see it, had not even been able to see the shape of it, had only been able to watch Avrasoli sit still for 23 minutes and know, and in the cold part of his chest where his instincts lived, that still was not the same as passive, still was something else entirely. On Earth, in a room that journalists did not have access to, the budget authorization cleared the Joint Defense Committee in 40 minutes. 40 minutes. The standard timeline for a defense budget authorization was 8 months minimum. 8 months of committee hearings and public comment periods and cross-departmental review, and 3 rounds of legal assessment and at least 2 rounds of revision. 8 months was considered fast. 12 was more common, 40 minutes. There were no committee hearings. There was no public comment period. There was a vote, and the vote was unanimous, and the authorization was signed before the ink on the record was dry. The budget was not released publicly. So the line items were classified. What was released through a standard press channel was a single paragraph that said the Terran Compact had reallocated strategic reserve funding in response to recent border security incidents, and that full details would be made available through appropriate disclosure channels in due course. The press paragraph was written in the flattest, most bureaucratic language available. It was specifically designed to sound boring. This was intentional. A Varith intelligence analyst named Vel Theron read the press paragraph in her office on Dominion Station at 1400 hours on the day after the coalition session. She read it twice. Then she looked up what strategic reserve funding encompassed in the Terran Compact's defense budget classification system. She read for 2 hours, then she filed her first report. Her report said, in precise and supported language, that the speed of the budget authorization was not consistent with any previously documented Terran Compact response to a border incident. It said that the specific classification tier of funds being accessed, strategic reserve, not operational response, not emergency maintenance, was associated historically with large-scale force projection rather than defensive posturing. It said that based on these 2 data points alone, without access to any classified information, the Dominion's risk assessment of the Kepler-7 response should be elevated immediately. Her supervisor read the report and wrote back in 20 minutes. The response said, analysis noted, current consensus is that the compact is performing for domestic audiences. Already maintains standard monitoring protocols. Vel Theron read the response. She filed it. She started a second document, not a report, just a file for herself, a place to put things she was seeing that she wanted to have a record of. She put the budget data in it. She put something else in it too, something she had found while looking up the strategic reserve classification, a small piece of human public record that had nothing to do with the budget and everything to do with what the budget was for. It was a phrase, 2 words. She had found them in a human historical document describing the outcome of a conflict that had happened on Earth roughly 300 years ago. A conflict between humans, a terrible one by any measure. The document used numbers that were difficult to process. And at the end of it, what the surviving parties had made an agreement, and the agreement had a principle at its center, and the principle was these 2 words. She ran them through her translation matrix. The matrix gave her 6 different interpretations. All 6 were slightly different. All 6 were correct simultaneously. Never again. She read all 6 interpretations. She sat with them for a while. She looked out her office window at Dominion Station's main corridor, at the Vareth officers and officials moving through their day, carrying files and drinking their equivalent of coffee, and talking to each other the way people talked when they believed their world was stable. She put the 2 words in her private file. Then she went back to monitoring the Terran Compact's public communications. She would file 4 more reports in the next 2 weeks. Each one would be more specific than the last. Each one would be returned with a variation of the same response. Noted, consensus unchanged, maintain standard protocols. She stopped arguing with the consensus. She started watching departure logs from Sol Station. In the meantime, Earth was not announcing anything. No press conferences, no speeches. Parliament did not convene an emergency session. The Secretary General did not address the public. The Terran Compact's official communication office released 2 statements in the week following the coalition session. One confirming receipt of the Vareth condolence message, one noting that the Compact was reviewing its border security infrastructure in light of recent events. Both statements were short. Both statements used the flattest language available. This was not an accident. Avra Solis had a theory about threats. She had developed it over 31 years of watching the ways that species communicated power to each other. The theory was this: a threat announced is a performance. It is sound made by something that needs to be heard because it is not yet sure it will be taken seriously. What cannot be ignored is not a threat. It is a fact. She was not making threats. She was building facts. The 47 names were still in her jacket pocket. She had not taken the paper out again. She didn't need to. She knew them. She knew them in the specific way you know something that you have decided is the reason for everything you're about to do. She had a meeting in 2 hours with the Military Command Council. She had a meeting after that with the Intelligence Directorate. She had a call scheduled with 4 coalition members who had reached out privately after the session. Not officially, not on record, just calls from people who had seen Counselor Meath's face in the corridor and wanted to know what Avra Solis had said in that private room. She didn't take any of those calls. She went to her meetings. She came back to her office and worked late. She did not eat dinner. She looked at her desk and she thought about 47 people in a station at the edge of map space, growing tomatoes under grow lights that stayed on until the very end. And she thought about a beacon cycling through frequencies, trying to stay alive long enough to be heard. And she thought about what it meant that it had taken 9 hours for anyone to hear it. She thought about what it meant that the Vareth Dominion had counted 47 people, filed them as a notation, and called the operation closed. She had spent 31 years trying to prevent this specific kind of moment. She had sat in rooms and talked until her voice gave out and signed papers that made nobody perfectly happy, because perfectly happy was not available in the real world, but acceptable was, and acceptable kept people alive. She had believed, for a very long time, that acceptable was worth fighting for. She still believed it. She also believed something else now, a thing she had believed before, but had not had to act on in this specific way. She believed that there were certain miscalculations that could not go uncorrected without becoming permissions. And a permission, given once, became a precedent. And a precedent became a pattern. And a pattern became the ordinary shape of things, the way the world worked, the assumption baked into every future calculation made by every species looking at the Terran Compact and deciding what they could get away with. 47 was not a number she was willing to let become ordinary. She opened her desk drawer and took out a fresh piece of paper. She did not write names this time. She wrote 3 words. Then she picked up her secure line and made a call. The person on the other end picked up immediately. "Is it ready?" she said. "Yes," the person said. "Then we begin," she said. She put down the phone. Outside her window, Earth turned in the dark the way it always had, patient and blue and full of people who did not know on this specific night what was being decided in a quiet office in their name. In 6 weeks they would know. Everyone would know. The universe had a way of making sure that certain decisions did not stay quiet. Valtherin had a very good mind. This was not her opinion of herself. It was the documented assessment of 4 separate evaluation boards across her 18 years in Vareth Dominion intelligence, each of which had used slightly different language and arrived at the same conclusion. She saw patterns that other analysts missed. She drew conclusions from incomplete data with a precision that bordered on uncomfortable. and she was consistently correct at a rate that made her supervisors trust her output and occasionally resent her for it. She had never worked a case that frightened her. She was working one now, and the assignment had started simply enough. After the coalition session, the Dominion Intelligence Directorate had tasked 3 analysts with monitoring the Terran Compact's response posture. Standard reactive assessment. Watch the public signals, correlate with known military doctrine, produce a projected response timeline and probability matrix for escalation levels 1 through 5. Level 1 was diplomatic protest. Level 5 was open conflict, which the Directorate had internally rated at roughly 8% probability. The other 2 analysts produced their assessments in 10 days. Level 2 most likely, formal condemnation, possible trade restrictions, heightened border patrols. They used words like measured and proportional and within expected parameters. Vel Theron had not produced her assessment in 10 days, when she was still reading. She had started where any intelligence analyst would start. Current military posture, recent deployment patterns, known hardware inventories, public statements from compact leadership, standard material. She had processed it quickly, the way she processed things, and found it unremarkable. The compact's military was large. It was well-funded. Its public statements were carefully boring. None of that told her what she wanted to know. What she wanted to know was not what the humans were doing now. What she wanted to know was what they were capable of. What she wanted to know was the ceiling. She started reading their history. She requested access to the Directorate's Alien Culture Archive, which held academic and intelligence-gathered material on every species in the Coalition going back 300 years. When the Terran Compact section was large, humans had been in contact with the Galactic community for 62 years and had been producing documentation about themselves for thousands of years before that. The archive held translations of histories, military records, political analyses, personal accounts, legal documents. She read for 4 days straight with minimal sleep, which was not unusual for her during a deep case. By the end of the 4th day, she was not eating either. The humans as a species were not new to war. She had known this in the abstract. Every intelligence briefing on the Terran Compact noted that humans had a significant documented history of conflict. This was usually framed as a risk factor. Species with high internal conflict histories tended toward aggressive external posturing. The briefings treated it the way you might treat the history of any martial species. Notable, worth monitoring, manageable with appropriate diplomatic pressure. What the briefings did not adequately communicate, what Vel Theron was now sitting with in a way that had changed the quality of her sleep, was the specific character of human warfare. Not that they fought themselves. For most of their recorded history, humans had been in conflict not with other species but with other humans. Thousands of years of internal war, continent against continent, nation against nation, and several distinct, documented times, organized campaigns to eliminate entire categories of their own people. Not in the heat of battle, planned, systematic, industrial in one particularly documented case, where they had built infrastructure specifically for the purpose of killing categories of people at scale. She had read that document 3 times. She had needed to stop between readings. What she was trying to understand was not the horror of it, though the horror was real and she was not someone who processed it easily. What she was trying to understand was the aftermath, because every one of these events had an aftermath. And the aftermaths were the part the Directorate briefings had not told her about. The aftermaths were where the humans built the philosophy. Every major internal catastrophe in human history had produced in its wake a formal and serious effort to understand what had happened and to construct systems designed to prevent it from happening again. Laws, institutions, international agreements, and concepts formalized in language. The word genocide, coined by a human scholar to name a thing that humans had done and then decided required naming so that it could be prosecuted. Tribunals, courts, treaties, and underneath all of it, beneath all the formal structures, a principle that Vel Theron had found in approximately 40 separate sources across 300 years of human documentation. Never again. Not as a slogan, as a commitment, as a weight that a species carried after it had looked directly at what it was capable of and decided, formally, publicly, legally, morally, that certain things could not be allowed to happen twice. She had run the phrase through her translation matrix 6 times. The matrix gave her different outputs each time. Not once more, never a repetition, this and never after, the end of such things. On no second time, it stops here. All 6 were correct. None of them captured it. The thing she kept returning to, the thing that was disrupting her sleep in a way that she would not have admitted to her supervisors, was this. The humans had built never again as a response to things they had done to themselves, to each other, to people who looked like them, spoke like them, lived among them. If they had built it as a response to internal atrocity, if they had decided that even within their own species, certain things could not go unanswered. She filed her 3rd report. The report laid out, with full citations and a supporting data appendix, the pattern she was seeing in the budget authorization, the departure logs from Sol Station, and the specific historical precedents she had identified in the human archive. She concluded the report with a risk reassessment. Probability of level 5 escalation should be updated from 8% to no less than 61%, pending additional departure data. The directorate response came back in 6 hours. Analysis noted, the historical parallels you have drawn are academically interesting, but operationally overstated. Human historical patterns are not reliable predictors of modern compact policy, which operates within coalition diplomatic norms. Current consensus remains level 2, with a ceiling of level 3. Revise your probability matrix accordingly. Vel Theron read the response. She did not revise her probability matrix. She opened her private file and added the response to it. Then she went to the Sol Station departure logs. She had been watching the logs for 2 weeks. The public portion of Sol Station's departure registry was updated daily, because coalition transparency protocols required major civilian and military installations to publish traffic summaries. The summaries were vague by design: vessel class, departure time, filed destination region, but they were regular and they were consistent, and she had 3 months of baseline data to compare against. The baseline was changing. For 3 months, Sol Station had averaged 14 to 17 military departures per day. Mixed classes, patrol vessels, supply ships, escort frigates, normal operational traffic for a species with the compact's border commitments, steady and unremarkable. In the week following the coalition session, the daily average had risen to 22. In the second week, 31. She was now in the 3rd week, and the daily average was 47. She stared at that number. 47. The same number. She did not believe it was a message. She believed it was a coincidence. But she sat with it for a longer moment than was strictly analytical, because some numbers, once you knew what they meant, could not be looked at plainly. The departures were not the thing that was keeping her awake at night, though the rate was alarming. The thing that was keeping her awake at night was the class. 11 days ago, 3 vessels had departed Sol Station with destinations filed under the classification, Strategic, Reserved Corridor. That destination code did not appear in any public coalition registry. It was a compact internal code. She had found a reference to it in a declassified compact logistics manual from 40 years ago, buried in a footnote. Why the manual listed it as a destination classification for vessels operating under Strategic Reserve Authority. She looked up what vessels operated under Strategic Reserve Authority. She found the ARC-class designation. She read everything available about ARC-class vessels. The compact had not publicized them. There was limited open-source material. What she found was thin and carefully distributed. A mention in a construction contract published under Coalition Infrastructure Transparency Rules, a reference in a decommissioned vessel manifest, a brief technical note in an academic paper on compact engineering capacity. From the pieces, she built a picture. ARC-class vessels were not combat ships in the traditional sense. They were classified by the compact as planetary infrastructure support ships. Their stated function was large-scale terraforming assistance and colony construction. They were enormous. The construction contract noted a hull length that she read 3 times because the number seemed wrong until she checked the unit conversion. 12 kilometers. She checked the unit conversion 4 times. 12 kilometers long. Their weapon systems were not detailed in any available source. They were listed in the contract as standard defensive armament, which was the language used for things you did not want to specify publicly. 3 had departed under Strategic Reserve Authority 11 days ago. Then 7 more. She was now watching the logs in real time. She had set an alert on her terminal for any departure coded to Strategic Reserve. The alert had triggered 14 times total. 14 ARC-class vessels, gone from Sol Station, filed under a destination code that meant, based on everything she could find, that they were going somewhere that the Compact had decided the public did not need to know about. She filed her 4th report. This one she addressed not to her direct supervisor, but to the deputy director of the directorate, which was outside her normal reporting chain and would be noted as an irregularity. She included the departure data, the class analysis, the historical precedent documentation, and a revised risk assessment. Probability of Level 5 escalation, 83%. Recommended immediate diplomatic contact with the Terran Compact through back channels. Recommended formal emergency session of the Vareth High Council's Defense Committee. Recommended evacuation planning for Dominion civilian populations in border regions. She submitted the report. Then she looked at her desk. She had a photograph on her desk. Most intelligence analysts didn't keep personal photographs at their workstations. It was considered unprofessional. Vel Theron kept one because she had decided years ago that maintaining the appearance of not being a person was a form of self-erasure that she was not interested in. The photograph was of her family, her mother, her 2 younger siblings, her older brother and his children. They lived on Vareth Prime. They lived in the district near the coastal ridge, where the buildings were old and the markets were loud, and her mother made a dish on holidays that Vel Theron had eaten her entire life, and associated in the deepest part of her with the word home. She looked at the photograph for a while. Then she looked at her terminal, at the departure log alert sitting at the top of her screen, at the number 14. She thought about never again. She thought about a species that had looked at its own capacity for destruction and decided to build a wall of principle against it, and had then carried that principle forward for 300 years as a reason and a weight and a promise. She thought about what it meant when a species that had made that promise looked at 47 of its own people, gone, and began moving 12-kilometer ships in groups of 14. The deputy director's response to her 4th report came back in 8 hours. Your concern is noted. We are aware of the departure data and have assessed it as consistent with the Compact's standard force rotation cycle, which coincidentally aligns with this period in their operational calendar. The class designation data you have found is incomplete, and your architectural estimates may be inaccurate. The Directorate maintains its current assessment. You are directed to align your outputs with consensus. This is the final note on this topic from this office. Final note. She read it. She saved it to her private file. She closed her official reports folder. She opened a personal travel request, a form she had never filled out before in 18 years, and requested emergency personal leave for a family visit to Vareth Prime. Standard form, approved automatically by the administrative system because she had not taken personal leave in 2 years and had accumulated more than enough. Departure in 3 days. She packed 1 bag. She took her private file on a physical storage unit, the kind that did not connect to any network, small enough to fit in the inside pocket of a travel coat. She took the photograph from her desk and wrapped it carefully. She sent her mother a message, said she was coming to visit, said she would be there before the week was out, said to please make the holiday dish even though it was not a holiday, because she was hungry for it in the specific way you were hungry for things you associated with being small and safe. Her mother sent back an enthusiastic response and several questions about dietary preferences of any guests Vel Theron might be bringing. There were no guests. Vel Theron sat in her office for the last time, looking at her now empty desk, and thought about 8%. 8% had been the Directorate's original probability of open conflict. 8% was a number that let people sleep. It was a number that let you file the operation as closed and move on to the next item. It was a number you arrived at when you thought about the Terran Compact in terms of what you had seen before, their previous responses to border incidents, their diplomatic behavior, their pattern of working within coalition frameworks. She had thought about what you had not seen before. She had thought about what a species did when something triggered the specific part of them that had decided, 300 years ago, that certain things would not happen twice. The departure logs updated. 3 more vessels, strategic reserve destination code, 17 total. She closed her terminal. She picked up her bag. She walked out of the directorate building into the cool gray morning of Dominion Station and went to catch her transport to Vareth Prime, where her mother was already planning what to cook, and her nephew was probably doing something loud, and the markets near the coastal ridge would be setting up for the day, the vendors laying out their goods on the old stone pavements the same way they had for centuries. She walked fast. She did not look back at the building. She thought, for no reason she could fully explain, about a botanist she had never met, growing tomatoes with names in a station at the edge of charted space. And she thought about the specific stubbornness of that act, the refusal to treat small things as unimportant. And she thought that she understood it better now than she would have 2 weeks ago. There were some things you did because the alternative was to become someone who didn't do them. She was going home. She did not know if home would still be home when this was over. She did not let herself think about the probability of that. She just walked. The Vareth defense grid around the Homeworld was, by any reasonable standard, exceptional. It had taken 40 years to build and had been upgraded 3 times. It consisted of 12 orbital platforms armed with long-range strike capability, a network of 400 autonomous intercept drones, 17 planetary defense cannons embedded in the crust at strategic latitudinal points, and a fleet of 60 fast-response warships permanently stationed in a rotating patrol pattern across 3 orbital bands. The High Council had commissioned a military review board to assess it 5 years ago. The board had concluded that the grid could repel any attack mounted by any known hostile actor in the current galactic threat environment. The board had not known about Ark-class vessels. Almost nobody had known about Ark-class vessels. The first alert came from the outer sensor net at 0340 Vareth Prime local time. The sensor operator on duty was a young officer named Dran Celis, who was 23 years old and in the 14th month of his posting, and he had never in 14 months seen the alert category that appeared on his board. He read the classification code. He read it again. He looked up the classification in his manual, which he had not opened in 11 months. Unknown vessel class. Mass estimate, uncertain. His drive signature, Terran compact. Quantity, multiple. He opened a channel to his watch supervisor. "Sir," he said, "you need to see my board." The watch supervisor saw his board. The watch supervisor opened a channel to the shift commander. The shift commander saw the board. 17 minutes after the first alert, the information was in front of the Defense Committee duty officer, who was in front of the High Council emergency line, which woke up people who were not used to being woken up. And there was a period of approximately 40 minutes during which Vareth Prime's military command structure was doing something it almost never needed to do, which was operate faster than it had planned for. Commander Soth Kirill was recalled from his quarters. He had been home for 3 weeks, filed his operation as closed, received a commendation notation from the Border Affairs Division, and begun the ordinary process of an ordinary career continuing in its ordinary direction. He had attended 2 planning sessions for the next quarter's patrol schedule. He had visited his sister. He had started a book. He was in his uniform and in a transport vehicle 18 minutes after the call came. He stood in the Defense Command Center at 0517 and looked at the tactical display. The display showed Vareth Prime in the center. The orbital grid was lit up around it. The 12 platforms, the drone network, the patrol fleet in their rotating bands. All of it visible, all of it active, all of it performing the function it had been built for. At the edge of the display, at the boundary of the inner system, there were 17 contacts. They were stationary. They had dropped out of faster-than-light travel approximately 40 minutes ago, at a distance of roughly 900,000 kilometers from the Homeworld, and they had not moved since. No approach vector, no evasive pattern, no reaction to the patrol fleet scrambling. They had come out of transit and stopped, just stopped. Soth Kirill looked at the mass estimates. The sensor system was still trying to resolve them. The numbers kept updating, each one larger than the last because the sensor system's estimation algorithm worked by refining its calculations as it gathered more data. and each refinement was producing a number that the system itself appeared to be having difficulty believing. "What is that reading?" he said to the sensor chief. The sensor chief was a veteran of 12 years. She did not look up from her board. "Connor, it's the hull mass, sir. We're still refining." "Refine it faster." "Yes, sir." A pause. "The current best estimate is 12 kilometers per vessel." The room was quiet, not the productive quiet of people working, the other kind. 12, South Korea said. "Per vessel," the sensor chief said. 17 vessels. He looked at the display. 17 points of light at the edge of his system, still and patient and larger than anything he had any frame of reference for. He had reviewed the intelligence assessments on Terran compact military capacity during his career, several times. He had read about their fleet composition and their operational doctrine and their power projection range. He had read briefings that told him the compact was a significant regional power that needed careful management. He had read assessments that rated their military capability as substantial but not decisive relative to the combined Varith defense posture. He had never read anything about these ships. He thought about the word substantial. The patrol fleet had scrambled on alert the moment the contacts appeared. 60 fast response warships in full combat configuration, moving to intercept vectors, broadcasting challenge codes on all standard frequencies. The 17 contacts did not respond to the challenge codes, not jamming them, not responding, just not responding. The way you did not respond to something that did not require a response. "Hailing frequencies," he said. "Open and broadcasting, sir," communication said. "All standard bands and 3 coalition emergency bands." No response. The patrol fleet moved into intercept position. 160 ships, forming a wall between the Homeworld and the 17 contacts. It was the correct doctrine. It was what the defense grid was designed to do. It looked on the tactical display, organized and capable and real. The 17 contacts did not move. They sat at the edge of the system, and they said nothing, and they did nothing, and they waited in the specific way that things waited when they had already decided what they were going to do, and were simply giving a pause before they did it. South Korea studied them. He had been in 14 engagements. He knew the rhythm of conflict. He knew what ships that were about to attack looked like. The formation shifts, the targeting system handshakes that showed up as sensor flickers, the small adjustments in orientation that preceded weapons lock. He had seen it. He knew what it looked like. He did not know what this looked like. This looked like nothing he had ever seen. An aide came to his side. "Sir, coalition channels are active. The Varith ambassador on Nexus Station has been notified." "What's his status?" "He's in session with the Coalition Mediation Panel, requesting intervention." "Good," he nodded. "Keep me updated." He looked at the 17 contacts. He thought about Kepler 7. He thought about it in the specific way that his brain would not let him avoid, in the same way that you could not stop a tooth from hurting by deciding not to feel it. He thought about the briefing, the 47, the word low. He thought about how clean the report had felt, how complete, how finished. He thought about the distress beacon that had spent 9 hours transmitting into empty space. He had not thought about the beacon after filing the report. He had filed the operation as closed, and he had not thought about it. But he was thinking about it now, standing in the Defense Command Center, looking at 17 ships that each massed 12 kilometers and were not responding to hail. He was thinking about a small automated system, built to be hard to kill, still cycling through frequencies after the main power was gone, still doing the job it was built to do. Someone had cared enough to build it that way. Someone had thought, what if everything else goes dark? What if the worst thing happens? They had sat down and engineered a solution to that question. They had made the worst possible scenario survivable for long enough to be heard. He understood now, standing here, that he had fundamentally misread what that said about the people he had put it up against. At 0700, a single transmission came from the Terran compact fleet. Not to Varith Prime, not to the defense grid, not to the patrol fleet scrambled between the contacts and the Homeworld. The transmission was addressed to the Galactic Coalition. Open broadcast. Every frequency, every channel, standard and secure and diplomatic and civilian. It was Avra Solis. Her voice was calm in the way that things were calm when they had decided. Not the calm of someone who was controlled because they were afraid. The calm of someone who had done the accounting and arrived at a number and was reading the number aloud. The Terran Compact invokes the Kepler-7 protocol under Article 9 of the Compact Defense Charter, she said. The action being taken is within Terran jurisdiction and is consistent with the Compact's documented obligations under its internal law. The Galactic Coalition is not requested to intervene, and intervention would not be appropriate. This transmission serves as formal notification of intent as required by the Charter. That was the complete transmission, not a threat, not a demand, not a list of grievances or a catalog of injuries or a promise of what would happen if conditions were not met. A notification of intent, filed as required, clean and formal and absolutely without mercy. In the Coalition chamber on Nexus Station, Ambassador Velsan heard the transmission through his earpiece. While sitting in the private session he had called into emergency, he stood up. He began speaking in a voice that was not his political voice. He was saying things about intervention, about proportionality, about the established norms of coalition conflict resolution. A human delegate, a junior member of the Compact's coalition team, a young man no one had paid particular attention to for the entire session, reached over and put his hand flat on the table. Not to interrupt, not to make a point, just to feel something solid. Velsan kept talking. His voice filled the chamber. It echoed off the walls that the architects had built at equal height for every species so that everyone would feel the same. He talked about law and precedent and the Dresch ruling and the 14 pillars of coalition conflict resolution and what it meant to exist in an interstellar community and what obligations that community carried. He talked for 22 minutes. Not one human in the room said anything. They sat and they listened and they said nothing. And the nothing they said was the loudest thing in the chamber. On Varith Prime, in the Defense Command Center, Soth Kirill read the transmission twice. He looked at the tactical display. The 17 contacts had not moved. The patrol fleet was holding its intercept position. The orbital platforms were at full readiness. He thought about what Avra Solis had not said. She had not said what they were going to do. She had not said when. She had not said what would stop it. She had filed a notification of intent as if she were filing a routine administrative document, and she had broadcast it to every frequency she could reach, and she had said nothing that gave him anything to argue with. "Open a direct channel," he said. "Free Terran Compact Fleet Command." "Channel open, sir." He spoke for 11 minutes. He was careful. He used language that was correct and legal and not inflammatory. He invoked the Dresch precedent. He offered a formal arbitration process. He offered a direct communication with the High Council. He offered a withdrawal to the pre-incident border arrangement pending a negotiated resolution. He offered 3 separate pathways to an outcome that did not involve the 17 ships doing whatever it was they had been built to do. The channel was open. He could hear the connection holding. No one responded. He stopped speaking. He waited. Nothing. "Are they receiving?" he said to communications. "Yes, sir," communications said. "The channel is confirmed active on both ends." They were receiving. They were choosing not to answer. Yes, he sat down. He had not sat down in 4 hours. He sat down in his command chair and he looked at the display, and he felt something that he did not have a clean military word for. Not fear exactly. Not the fear of dying or the fear of losing. Something that was underneath both of those things. Something that was about being in a moment that could not be unhappened, that had been decided before you understood it was being decided, that had started 9 weeks ago in a system with a number instead of a name, when a man named Torres had laughed at a joke that Priya Okafor had laughed at too, and then mostly forgotten. He had not known Torres's name then. He had not known any of their names. He had known 47. He knew, sitting in his command chair with the channel open and the silence of the Terran Compact Fleet on the other end of it, that not knowing their names had been the fundamental error. Not the tactical error, not the diplomatic error, the fundamental one, the one that everything else was downstream of. 47 people had names and histories and reasons, and a botanist among them who named tomatoes after planets in old science fiction novels. and he had counted them and filed them and called the operation closed. Somewhere on Vareth Prime, near a coastal ridge, in a district with old buildings and loud markets, a woman was probably cooking something that her daughter liked, and the vendors were probably setting up for the day on old stone pavements. Max and the children were probably doing whatever children did in the particular loud and unstoppable way of children everywhere. He thought about this. He looked at the 17 contacts. He put in a call to the High Council. There were things he needed to say to them, things he should have said before the operation, things he had not known he needed to say, which was not an excuse, which was simply the shape of what it looked like to be wrong in this specific way. He would say them now. It was late, but he would say them. Outside the system, 17 ships held their position in silence, patient as the dark they had come out of, waiting in the way that things waited when the decision had already been made. And the only remaining question was which direction the other party wanted history to point from here. The channel was still open. The silence continued. It was not an empty silence. It was the loudest thing South Korea had ever heard. The coalition chamber was full. Every seat, which was not unusual for a formal session. But this was different from the ordinary fullness of an ordinary session. Nobody was arranging documents. Nobody was checking their translation earpieces or adjusting the height of their seats. Nobody was talking to the delegate next to them in the low private murmur that usually filled the pre-session minutes. 214 seats, 214 species. Silence. It had been 6 weeks since the Kepler-7 protocol transmission. 6 weeks since the 17 ships had held their position in the dark of the Vareth system and said nothing and let nothing be the answer. 6 weeks since a chapter of galactic history had closed in a way that nobody had found the right words for yet. Because the right words required a kind of honesty about what had happened that was very difficult to sit with and almost impossible to say in a room built to make everyone feel equal. Secretary Avra Solis entered at 900 exactly. She walked to the Terran compact desk and she sat down and she folded her hands and she looked at the center floor. The same posture as 6 weeks ago. The same stillness, as if the two sessions were connected by a thread, and she was simply picking it back up. The session chair called the record open. Quorum confirmed. The matter before the chamber. The formal coalition response to the Vareth Kepler-7 incident and the subsequent Terran compact action. He opened the floor. Nobody stood. The chamber sat in its silence and nobody moved, and the session chair waited because this was his job and there was nothing else to do. The session chair was a Merivian, a species known for patience in a way that had become mildly legendary in diplomatic circles, and he was still finding this silence difficult. 1 minute. 2. A Qatari delegate stood. She was old enough to have attended sessions no one else in the room remembered. She looked around the chamber once. She sat back down without speaking. It was not the time for what she wanted to say. An Oresi delegate began to stand, caught the look from the delegate beside him, and changed it into an adjustment of his chair position. 3 minutes. Avra Solis stood. The chamber breathed. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out a piece of paper. She unfolded it on the desk in front of her, the same way she had 6 weeks ago. She looked at it. Then she looked up at the chamber. I would like to read into the formal coalition record the names of the personnel who were present at Kepler-7 Outpost on the date of the Vareth Dominion attack, she said. Her voice was the same as it had been 6 weeks ago. Even, factual, the voice of someone reading a list of things that were true. She read slowly. Each name was its own sentence. The chamber did not move. Dr. Preet Anand, Commander J-10, Lieutenant Sana Koronen, Specialist Torres, Raphael, Specialist Chen, May, Dr. Lena Marsh, Lieutenant Commander Abibi Jonas. She read for 11 minutes, every name, 47 names. The chamber held each one. When she finished, she folded the paper and put it back in her pocket. The Terran Compact has no statement to make at this time, she said. We are available for questions from the mediation panel. She sat down. The Qatari ambassador stood. Her voice was very measured. Secretary Solis, on behalf of the Qatari delegation, and I believe I speak for many members of this chamber. We acknowledge the losses at Kepler-7. We recognize the pain of the Terran Compact in this matter. She paused. We must also speak to the action that was taken in response. The scope of it, the permanence of it. Solace looked at her. The Galactic Coalition's conflict resolution protocols exist for a reason, the Qatari ambassador continued. The principle that disputes are mediated, not resolved unilaterally, is foundational to what this chamber represents. What the Terran Compact has done, the manner in which it was done, outside the coalition framework, without allowing the mediation process to proceed, sets a precedent that this body cannot simply absorb without response. A pause. We need to understand, the ambassador said more quietly. We need to understand why this path was chosen. Solace looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the chamber. The Terran Compact chose this path because we had read our own history, she said. And our history told us, with a great deal of evidence, what happens when we allow certain acts to become ordinary. When we treat certain numbers as acceptable, when we look at something that has been done to our people, file it and move on, she paused. Our history told us what that becomes. Eventually. Well, given enough time and enough repetition. A pause. We were not willing to find out if the answer was the same. The chamber was quiet. A border outpost, the Qatari ambassador said. 47 personnel. Yes, Solace said. You understand what I'm asking. I understand exactly what you are asking, Solace said. And I am telling you that the question of whether 47 was small enough to absorb and move on from is the exact question we have been asking ourselves for 300 years. The answer we have arrived at is that there is no number small enough. There is no outpost remote enough. There is no attack minor enough to set down without answer. She looked at the paper in her pocket, or looked toward it. Our people had names. We said them. They are in the record. That is where they will stay. The Qatari ambassador sat down. The Moravian session chair gave the floor to the mediation panel. The panel asked questions for 2 hours. Solace answered them in the same voice. Even and factual and without drama. She did not raise her voice. She did not lower it. She answered every question as if it were a reasonable question to ask, and the answer were a reasonable thing to know. One of the panel members, a young Theresi delegate who had joined the coalition service recently and who had not been in the chamber 6 weeks ago, asked whether the Terran Compact had any regret regarding the action taken. Solace looked at the delegate. She looked at the delegate for long enough that the delegate began to regret asking. The Terran Compact, she said, deeply and completely regrets Kepler-7. She said nothing else. The delegate waited for the rest of the answer. It did not come. In a side room of the coalition complex, a woman named Veltherin was sitting with a glass of water she had been given by a coalition aide, waiting to give her formal testimony. She had arrived at Nexus Station 6 days ago, brought in by a compact diplomatic transport that had met her at a civilian transit hub. She did not know how they had known where she was. She had not asked. She had simply been on a transport platform on Varith Prime, waiting for a connection that would take her somewhere with less gravity pressing on her chest. And there had been a human diplomatic courier who had approached her and said her name as a question, and she had said yes, and the courier had handed her a travel document. And here she was. She had given a preliminary testimony over 2 days. It had been thorough. The coalition investigators had been professional and had asked good questions, and she had answered them completely because she had a private file and a physical storage unit in her coat pocket, and she had been saving this file for the people who would ask the right questions. Now she was waiting for the formal record session. She looked at the glass of water. She thought about the reports she had filed, the ones that had come back with noted consensus unchanged, the ones she had stopped filing because there was no point. She thought about her supervisor's final note. This is the last note from this office on this topic. And she thought about what it meant that she had been correct and had been overruled, and that being correct had not been enough. Being correct never felt the way you expected it to feel. She had expected it to feel like something, like a point proven, like the satisfaction of a calculation that resolves. It felt like loss. The aide appeared in the doorway. They're ready for you. She stood. She picked up the storage unit. She walked to the door and stopped. Is there anything you need? The aide said. No, she said. Thank you. She went in and sat in the chair provided for her and looked at the panel and told them everything. She started from the beginning, from the budget authorization press paragraph that she had read on the day after the coalition session, from the word low in South Korea's operational report, from her first translation of never again through all 6 interpretations that were all correct and none of them complete. She told them about the departure logs, about the 14 alert triggers, about the photograph on her desk and her mother's question about dietary preferences. She told them about the moment she decided to stop filing reports and start packing. The panel listened. One of them asked, "Did you believe, at any point, that you could have changed the outcome?" Veltharan thought about this. "I believed I could have changed it if I had been heard," she said. "I was not heard. The outcome would have been different. Not necessarily in the direction of peace. I want to be honest about that, but different. There were points at which a different decision by the High Council would have produced a different set of facts. Those points passed. Do you hold the Dominion High Council responsible?" "I hold them responsible for the decision they made," she said. "I hold them responsible for the 47 people at Kepler 7. I hold them responsible for not listening when the math was being done correctly." She paused. "I hold myself responsible for not trying harder to make them listen, for deciding that the argument was over when they stopped responding to me. I could have. There were other things I could have done," the panel wrote. "I did not do them," she said. She testified for 4 hours. When she was done, they thanked her, and a coalition aide walked her back to the side room with the glass of water. She sat back down in the same chair. The water was still there. She picked it up and drank it. She looked at her hands. She thought about her mother's cooking. She had made it to Vareth Prime. She had eaten the dish twice. She had slept in the room she had slept in as a child, under the window where you could hear the market starting up in the mornings, the vendors calling to each other as they set up. She had been there for 4 days. She had been gone before the 17 ships arrived. Her mother had been in the city when it happened. Her mother was fine. The coalition had told her this, and the coalition aide had confirmed it again when Veltharan arrived at Nexus Station. The city had not been touched. The coastal district had not been touched. The markets were not open the day it happened, but they had opened again since. The old buildings were still there. The targeted coordinates had been precise. This was not an accident. She understood it was not an accident. The Terran Compact's precision was a choice, the same way their silence had been a choice, the same way the notification of intent broadcast had been a choice. Every choice they had made in this process had been deliberate. They had chosen what to destroy, and they had chosen what to leave standing. And both choices meant something about who they were doing this to and who they were deciding should continue to exist. She did not know how to feel about this. She suspected she would not know for a very long time. She suspected this was the appropriate response to something this large. On the other side of the galaxy, in the debris field of Kepler 7 Outpost, the 47 were still there in the way that things remained after they were gone. As orbits, as trajectories, as the slow scatter of material that had once been organized by people into the shape of a place where people lived. The debris would orbit for centuries. The gas giant below it would continue to turn, unnamed in any chart, large and patient and entirely indifferent to the history that had happened in its gravity. In the debris somewhere was a personal log drive, small, black, tumbling. In it, in the files, were names. Tomato varieties named after planets in old science fiction novels. A botanist who had thought, at the edge of nothing, that naming things was worth doing. On the log drive tumbled. On Nexus Station, in a resupply bay 2 levels below the Coalition chamber, a maintenance technician named Haruto Watanabe was 16 hours into a 20-hour shift. He was 41 years old. He had been assigned to Nexus Station for 3 years. He was good at his job in the quiet and consistent way of people who had decided that being good at their job was enough reason to come back to it every day. He had a section of the resupply bay that was technically his workspace, and technically not supposed to have anything non-operational in it. He had a hydroponic tray tucked behind a coolant housing unit that nobody ever checked. He had set it up 11 days ago. He had put soil in it. Actual soil, out of which was expensive to ship to a station and which he had requested through a supply form as a standard component for the biological growth experiments that the station's science division occasionally ran, and which he had not exactly been authorized to take for this purpose. He grew tomatoes. They were small and still very young. Thin green stems and the first pairs of leaves, nothing yet. They needed about 8 more weeks before they would produce anything. He checked them twice per shift. He watered them with a small spray bottle he kept in his tool belt. Nobody had asked him why he was doing this. He was not sure he could have explained it, even if they had. He had seen the list of names. The one Avra Solis had read into the record. He had been in the resupply bay when the broadcast came through the station's general channel, and he had stopped what he was doing and stood very still and listened to all 11 minutes. He did not know Dr. Lena Marsh. He had not known any of them, but someone had told him. He could not remember exactly who. It had been in passing, one of those conversations that move through a station, the way all information moved through stations. That the last part of Kepler 7 to hold structure had been the hydroponics bay. That the grow lights had stayed on until the very end. He thought about that. He came back to the tray and tended to it, and did not think too hard about why. He just did it. The young stems stood in the soil, very green, very small, doing what growing things did. Reaching toward whatever light was available, or not using the time they had been given, not asking whether the ground they were in was permanent or safe or likely to last. Just growing. Outside, the stars were the same stars they had always been. The galaxy turned at the pace it always turned. The coalition chamber was filing its session records, and the mediation panel was writing its assessments, and ambassadors were sending reports to their home governments, and Avra Solis was in a transport back to Earth, sitting by the window, not sleeping, looking at nothing in particular. She had the paper in her pocket. She always had the paper. She thought about Torres and his joke that Priya Okafor had laughed at and not remembered. She thought about a beacon cycling through frequencies in the dark for 9 hours. She thought about a seat at a desk with a photograph of a family near a coastal ridge with loud markets and old buildings, belonging to a woman who had filed correct reports that nobody had read correctly and who had packed one bag and gotten out before the math arrived. She thought about what it cost to hold a line. She thought about what it cost to be the species that held it. She looked out the window. The stars did not answer. They never did. You held the line anyway, because the alternative was to become something that didn't.